If you ask a gamer about his memories of the PlayStation 2, he'll probably spend a lot of minutes complimenting the game, the great controller, and the console's revolutionary multimedia tool. Now, if you ask a developer about the features of the best-selling console in history, he'll probably tell you about the immense difficulty of making a game for the PlayStation 2. Sometimes the unparalleled success of the console makes it easy for many fans to forget that making games for the PlayStation 2, due to the specific architecture of the device, could be sometimes a huge challenge. Before rumors of the PlayStation 2 being a WMD, many developers had their first words after coming up with Sony's console were, "How do we make games for such a device?" The difficulty of making the game for the PlayStation 2 and the not-so-interesting relationship with the developers did not lead to the failure of the console. Contrary to predictions, it somehow benefited the PlayStation 2 and made it the most successful console in the gaming industry. What follows will not be a technical review of the PlayStation 2's hardware, and for simplicity, various topics will be discussed in a non-technical manner. First, we need to know what Sony was aiming for with a PlayStation 2 design. While there are still many unanswered questions about the history of the console, you should know that the most important goal of the PlayStation 2 was to produce a high-speed console that has not yet been built. Many of Sony's decisions about the design of the PlayStation 2 are related to the company's strong desire to build a fast console. Sony seemed to be frustrated with the PS1's ability to render and play games, which is why the company decided to focus on the speed of the device while designing the PlayStation 2. The low fill rate of the PS1, the number of pixels rendered in a second, was another issue Sony intended to fix with the PlayStation 2. While it's hard to find official information about the PlayStation 1's fill rate, it's lower than the N64 at 62.5 megapixels per second. The PlayStation 2's fill rate was 1.2 gigapixels per second. To understand how Sony could increase the rendering power of its console so much, you need to know a little bit about Emotion Engine. The engine is actually a CPU and is often referred to as the heart of the PlayStation 2. It's not a coincidence that if you're familiar with a PlayStation 2 piece, it's probably Emotion Engine. Sony was doing unprecedented marketing around the superpower of Emotion Engine at the time. The company made every effort to maneuver as much as possible on the speed of the piece and its significant difference from other CPUs. Prior to Emotion Engine, only Sega had a similar campaign about the considerable power of its console. Sony's campaign for the high power of Emotion Engine was so pervasive that some news sites published articles that read, "Will the PlayStation 2 replace your PC?" The release of this kind of news reflects unprecedented around the hardware power of the PlayStation 2. Even the name choice for this CPU was such that gamers were excited about a new generation of games. A generation that was supposed to revolutionize the gaming industry in terms of computing and processing power forever. Dreamcast's It's Thinking campaign also had a similar policy to the PlayStation 2. Another part of Sony's marketing campaign focused on how much more power Emotion Engine has than the Pentium processor on the Xbox. Emotion Engine is just one of several processors that the PS2 has used over the years. To achieve Sony's technical goals, the PlayStation 2 team of designers built several chips and processors for the Emotion Engine so that the CPU could perform at its best. This in itself is not a strange thing. Today, consoles and PCs use separate components to perform different functions. However, the unusual thing about the PlayStation 2 was how to use different components of the device at the same time, which forced games to adjust themselves based on the type of performance of the console. To compensate for the PS2's lack of raw power in some areas, Sony introduced a new functional definition for the console to keep data flowing continuously between the various processors in it. This idea on paper was a very good theory. The initial idea behind the PlayStation 2's unique architecture was that as long as developers fed the various processors on the PlayStation 2 with data and information in a constant and stable way, there would be no problem in making the game. The purpose of the PlayStation 2 was to build a highly processed console without focusing on conventional methods of processing and storing information. The truth is that Sony spent so much on the Emotion Engine chips that it had to make some changes to the usual data processing methods to respond to the CPU and make optimal use of it. Keep in mind that the problem wasn't the initial look of Sony and PlayStation. Those who looked at the PlayStation 2 architecture from the outside felt afraid of its awe. On the other hand, the fact is that the advancement of gaming technology in the present era owes to the innovation of the PlayStation 2. This reflects the right decisions made by the team and the potential of the device in the long run, and shows that Sony has not chosen the wrong path. But the fundamental problem is that the potential of an idea and its practicality are two distinct things. Although GameCube and Xbox have a lot in common and have been similar to traditional gaming consoles until then, PlayStation 2 led developers to redesign virtually everything while producing a game. The game maker's previous experience would certainly have helped them, but the truth is that making games for the PlayStation 2 simply wasn't possible, and developers had to reinvent themselves with the console and devote themselves to understanding its peculiar yet strange architecture. It seems that the development of the game for the PlayStation 2 was inevitable. If you had to go from point A to B while making the game on another platform, on PlayStation 2, you had to cross A1, A2, and A3 to get from A to B. If there was a problem with A3, the whole project could be damaged, and you wouldn't be able to use the console's maximum capacity. Each piece of the PS2 was important in its own heart, and even for small processing, you had to pay attention to each of these components. All of this while the initial design of the PlayStation 2 had an interesting idea. Sony, on the other hand, knew that modern games needed to process large amounts of data, so the company wanted to make sure that it was passed through the core components of its console so that it could be processed efficiently. In other words, the PlayStation 2's output was relatively effective, and the console was capable. However, it was the PlayStation 2's input and data logging that forced developers to understand the console's specific and complex architecture. Now we answer the question, why was the process of making games so difficult for the PlayStation 2? Probably the most important reason for this should be in the process of learning how this console works. You may be wondering how difficult it was to learn the PlayStation 2 architecture from the beginning. Resident Evil director Shinji Mikami says that Sony's biggest mistake during the development of the PlayStation 2 was not providing effective and easy resources for developers. In fact, there was virtually no way to learn how the console would function and capabilities in a reasonable amount of time. The truth is that the design of the PlayStation 2 was very complicated at its core, but the fact that Sony didn't try to streamline the process of learning how its console works caused developers to face a lot of problems. On the other hand, the occasional information about how the PlayStation 2 works is not widely understood, and everyone involved in the process of making games for different consoles soon realized that the PlayStation 2 version would be much more difficult to produce. You might say to yourself, the fact that so many studios didn't avoid making games for the PlayStation 2 because of the difficulty it was to work with is something of a miracle. Not every studio was able to spend months figuring out how a console works. On the other hand, those developers who decided to make games for the PlayStation constantly wondered why Sony made the process of making games so complicated for their console, while other consoles are devoid of these complexities. It should be noted that many developers, while making the game for the PlayStation 2, noticed some shortcuts and tried to simplify the process of getting from point A to B. This might have made them unable to use the maximum functionality of the PlayStation 2, but that would make their games available to the vast community of fans. This may sound crazy, but it turns out that the fact that developers had to spend a lot of time developing a PS2 game. In the end, it ended up benefiting them. In 2015, Oddworld game developer Lorne Lanning was criticized by some media outlets for stating in an interview that former Sony boss Ken Kutaragi did not deserve a Lifetime Achievement Award because of the damage he had done to the gaming industry. Lanning says that the complexity of the PlayStation 2 game development process has made it impossible for developers to predict how much time the game they're developing will take. However, Lanning has praised Xbox for being easier to work with. Sony, on the other hand, has never denied that they deliberately made the PS2 and PS3 game development process difficult. The belief that only those who have made themselves fit to the best conditions are worthy of advancement has always been a controversial belief, but what Sony did in this regard can be somewhat harsh. The company knew that the process of making the game would be difficult and time-consuming for their console, but it didn't intentionally try to make the path easier for developers. On the other hand, it should be considered the benefits that come from studios making exclusive games for the PS2. Sony was confident that the vast PlayStation 2 fan community, even with hard work, would eventually encourage more developers to make games for their consoles. The difficulty of making the game for the PS2 meant that studios were spending more time developing the game for the console. The amazing thing about Sony's plan was that in practice, the company managed to make it work. The question of why, despite the difficulty of making a game for the PlayStation 2, it became the best-selling console in the gaming industry's history can have several answers. On the one hand, you should consider the attraction of the PlayStation 2 DVD player, because this factor has allowed Sony to reach many homes around the world in a short period of time. Very few developers were able to resist the idea of creating content for a console that had sold more than 130 million units. Game developers have faced the difficulties of making games for the PlayStation 2, and despite the difficulty of the development phases, have begun to produce games for Sony's next-generation console. In fact, they devoted themselves to learning how the PlayStation 2 would work, even if that reduced their focus when it came to producing games for other consoles. On the other hand, you should keep in mind that Sony's competitors didn't have many alternatives to choose from developers. Within 2 years of its release, Dreamcast had actually become an outdated console. With the launch of GameCube, Nintendo annoyed many studios and did not attempt to remove the opacity. The Xbox, although it had more power than the PlayStation 2 and was far easier to develop than the Sony console, did not succeed in the Japanese market and was also second in sales to the West over the PlayStation 2. While Nintendo and Microsoft later managed to take advantage of the difficulty of making a PlayStation 3 game to their advantage with the release of the Xbox 360 and Wii, none of them managed to ease the PS2's absolute dominance of the market. Finally, it should be noted that despite the difficulty of making the game for the PlayStation 2 and the complexity of its architecture that could have been annoying, the truth is that the Sony console was very powerful and managed to run titles that Xbox 360 and Dreamcast failed to do, despite the more power of them. Some consoles, such as Sega Saturn, which were difficult to develop the game, eventually acquired a number of titles that showed the gaming community how difficult it can be to work with such consoles. But the PlayStation 2 thing was completely different. The console managed to deliver everything Sony promised to the fans. While the PlayStation 2 could have been very difficult to make, the truth is that the graphical leap it showed compared to the predecessors was astonishing. The difficulty of making the game for the PlayStation 2 ultimately benefited Sony, making it the most successful console in the gaming industry.